Okay.
About 5 years ago, he suffered a massive stroke, and he's very debilitated on his left side, in a lot of pain all the time. And I'd just like to mention him in prayer.
So Alan is asking to pray for a friend from college, Billy Hayden. Billy Hayden had a stroke about 5 years ago, and he still has complications from that. Other requests this morning? Okay. If there's not anything else, Frank's going to lead us in prayer.
Let's pray together. Dear Heavenly Father, we praise you and thank you for this good day. We thank you for this opportunity to gather in your name here and pray you would bless this assembly. We pray, Heavenly Father, for Clay as he leads the class this morning, that you would help him to remember the things he's prepared and help to educate us on the Word of God. We pray, Heavenly Father, for these that have been mentioned this morning. We pray for the Ballards and the Chase families as they transition to this area. We pray that they'll be warmly welcomed and encouraged and lifted up in your sight. We pray, Heavenly Father, in gratitude for Jennifer's safe travels this week and the work resolutions that she's seen, that you would bless her in that. We pray for Russ and the surgery that he had, and grateful that he is recovering so well from that. We pray for Billy Hayden and the stroke and pain that he is going through, that you would bless him and encourage him. We also want to pray, Heavenly Father, for Anita and Roger Stone as they're dealing with Roger's latter stages of health, passing from this world. We pray for his soul, dear Heavenly Father. We pray in gratitude and humility. In Christ's holy name. Amen.
Just a couple of housekeeping notes here before we get into Revelation chapter 12. We noted several resources last week in our study of Revelation. I had about 5 or 6 books here on the table, and most of those have been added to the church library. So this is the second housekeeping note. Frank is going to be teaching for me next week. I'll be in Arkansas for a gospel meeting. So Frank will be teaching, and after he teaches, then you're welcome to borrow those resources. Okay? So about 5 or 6 books we've added to the church library that I recommended last week, and those are in memory of Cecil Ritchie. And so you can be looking for those in the coming weeks. Those are the 2 housekeeping notes, the books and Frank covering class next week. Same schedule. Next week you'll be in chapters 13 and 14 of Revelation. We'll do a little bit of review before we get into chapter 12. What's the book of Revelation about? Oh, come on now. It's Resurrection Day. Say it again. Jesus. There you go. The book of Revelation. If you get nothing else, you go away from this class, the book of Revelation is about Jesus. Now, there's a lot in it, but I want that image to be in your mind. It's not about warfare. It's not about all that stuff in it, but it's about Jesus. Okay. All right, just a couple of slides of review here. I'm not going to open these up one at a time because we've seen them so many times now. The author is John the Beloved, who wrote the Gospel of John, the letters 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. He's on the island of Patmos in exile, and he writes this book primarily, first and foremost, to Christians in Asia Minor, represented in the 7 churches that are addressed in chapters 2 and 3. The key themes of the book: victory and hope through the crucified and resurrected Jesus Christ. The image that's used in the book of Jesus to represent his crucifixion and his resurrection is... Anybody remember? What's the image for Jesus that represents that he was crucified and resurrected? It appears throughout the book. The lamb like slain. Good. And the context, when we look at those letters to the 7 churches, they're dealing with persecution and the sway of culture. That relevant? Persecution side, we don't see it as much in this country. Is the prevailing culture influential in the lives of Christians in every time and place? And is there ever a time and place in history when the prevailing culture is biblical? Biblical. You know, we sometimes we like to think that now is best. There's a camp of people that say forward is always better, the present is always what's best, and there's a camp of people who say the past is always better than the present. But the truth is, there is no time since Eden that the prevailing culture is in accordance with God's will. God's people are always going to be living among individuals and peoples and in societies that do not accept His standards. Okay? We said there are 4 major ways that people read the book of Revelation, and we've said that we might add a 5th because what we're doing in this class is some combination of all of these. Some people read the book and say everything in the book is about things that haven't happened yet. Some people read the book and say it's about things that have only happened in the past. Some people read the book and say that it's about things, it's a timeline that goes all the way through the end of time. And so we're somewhere in that timeline. And so our current state of history is represented somewhere in the book of Revelation. And then there are some who say, forget time altogether. There are only themes represented in this book, and those themes apply to all times. And we said, some of the book is about the future, some of the book is about the past, some of the book is about now, and some of the book is thematic. And that's not a cop-out. That's honoring, I think, the nature of the literature that we're studying. All right? This is a new slide. There are 6 cyclical visions in the book of Revelation. But as you can see on the screen, these visions overlap. So there are 6, but you might be at the end of one and you would have passed the beginning of the next if you're talking about time, for example. Okay? So graphic there is confusing, kind of like the book is confusing. 6 cyclical visions, and you can see them numbered on the screen. How do we know this? Well, you see that last major statement on the slide? Each cycle ends with a scene of celebratory worship. If you read the whole book and you say, okay, here's a place where in your modern Bibles, these places of worship often have offsets to let you know that there's poetry or there's a song that's being sung. If you identify these 6 scenes of worship, then you say, what comes before this? This is the period on this cycle. Does that make sense to everyone? And so the 6 scenes of worship tell us there are 6 cycles in this book. All right. Now, where are we right now? We've already talked about the 7 letters. We've already talked about the 7 seals on the scroll. We've already talked about now the 7 trumpets. We finished that cycle last week. Now remember, there are 3 cycles of judgment, and you can see those number 2, number 3, and number 5 on the screen. Actually, the 3rd judgment cycle some just identify as a portion of chapter 16. But nevertheless, right now we're in the first of 2 sections of unnumbered visions. Now, when we say unnumbered visions, we don't mean that you can't go in chapters 12 through 15 and say, well, there's this distinct scene and then this distinct scene. And what we're saying is the book itself doesn't number what takes place in chapters 12 through 15. Everybody see that? Okay. So we're in chapter 12. And introducing chapter 12, I wanted to share this quote. This is from one of the books that I recommended to you last week by Craig Kester. This section depicts a messianic war that extends from Christ's incarnation, chapter 12, verse 5, to his second coming, the end of chapter 14. Readers of John's time and readers of our own time live in between these 2 events. Now, here's what I like about this section. You see what he said. It's not that this is the only place in Revelation that would address what we're dealing with as Christians today. There are other places. But I really like this because chapter 12 really seems to bring home the fact that we are part of this ongoing battle, if you will. Now, I don't mean that in the way that some would mean it, but we are part of this struggle between good and evil that is depicted in the book of Revelation. So we're in chapter 12, and before I start launching into monologue, the goal of this class has been for you to help me as you build tools for your toolbox to interpret the book of Revelation. I think chapter 12 is actually one of the easiest chapters outside of chapters 2 and 3. What did you recognize? What did you notice in your reading of chapter 12 this past week? Anything you want to share from Revelation chapter 12? In no particular order. I'm not going to try to force you to walk through it in the order of the verses. Just whatever stood out to you. Frank?
In verse 5, it looks like the woman clothed with the sun and the moon gives birth to a child who is to rule all nations with a rod of iron. To me, that's Christ.
Yeah, good.
And he's caught up to God. So
Yeah.
at least I could recognize that portion.
Okay, good. So Frank says, I can recognize something in verse 5. This woman gives birth to a son, and the description of that son lets me know it's Jesus, because he's going to rule and he's caught up to God. Well, who else do we know that fits that description? And in fact, we'll talk a little bit about the background of verse 5 before the class is over. I'm trying to decide if I want to share one thing. There's a commentator by the name of Warren Wiersbe who made a pretty famous statement with reference to verse 5. So in the English Standard Version, verse 5 says, she gave birth to a male child, comma, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, comma, but her child was caught up to God and to his throne. He said that these two commas in verse 5 represent 33 years. Now, where did he get that number from, right? The child is born, he's described, and then he's in heaven. Well, if it's Jesus, he didn't go up to heaven just as soon as he was born, did he? So the point is, and this is the way Revelation reads, you have to be very careful trying to go, okay, I've got a very detailed timeline here. This description skips his whole life. Now, why does it skip his life? Because it's unimportant? I think there are two reasons probably why it skips his life. The first one is John assumes, who's the original audience of this book? 7 churches. Well, what kind of individuals make up churches? Christians. Do Christians know the story of Jesus' life? So John knows, and those who are delivering this vision to him know. They don't have to rehash all of that. They already know this. Okay. But second of all, it's not the point of emphasis. The point of emphasis is what happens after he is caught up to heaven, which is what you see as you continue reading in the chapter. Okay, what else did you notice or recognize? Yes, Jen?
It has the fiery red dragon, but it has 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his head. The thing I was confused on was 7 is the earth and God combined.
Mm-hmm.
So why would you have something that usually you think of as a good unity
Mm-hmm.
representing something with the dragon, which is not good?
Okay, good. So Jennifer says, when you look at the description of this fiery red dragon or serpent, he's got 7 heads. And we've said that when we look at these numbers in the book of Revelation, they're often symbolic. We said the number 3 is divine. The number 4 is earthly, the 4 corners of the earth, or the 4 directions, north, south, east, west. And so why is the dragon described with 7? 7 means completeness, which combination of heaven and earth. In this case, I think as we get later in the chapter, we find out he has, not to the degree that God does, but he has influence or wants to have influence over heaven and earth. Now, what happens when you get later in the chapter, you find out he no longer has influence in one of those realms, right? Okay. What else? Alan?
I don't know why it leaped out at me, but the second half of verse 7 and then verse 8, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
We know that after his fall,
Mm-hmm.
he, is speaking with the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes me think that that is a future event.
Okay. So Alan said that he thinks, and I'm going to disagree with you, and I'll explain why. Okay. Not to be disagreeable. Alan and I have a good relationship. Verses 7 and 8 says that Satan is cast out of heaven. And he says that's obviously not, for example, what in the timeline, what's going on in the book of Job, which I will agree with that part. Okay. So he says this is an event, at least we can agree on this. We may not agree when it was, but we can agree it's after the time of Job, for example. Okay. So, and that goes back to what we just said. Okay. So he's cast down. All right. What else? Anything else you recognize? Who's this dragon?
Satan.
How do you know that? It tells us. Oh, man. Don't you love it when the book tells you what something is? There's a lot in the book of Revelation that you read and you're trying to wrap your head around it. But here, the book tells us that this serpent, this dragon, he's that ancient serpent. He's that ancient serpent, the devil, called the devil and Satan. So we know who he is. Aren't you glad? That's in verse 9. All right, what else? Okay, they conquered him by the blood of the Lamb. So not only do we know, for example, it's after the time of Job, that in this case, what happens in verse 5, 6, this conquering is going to come chronologically after verses 5 and 6. The Son is born. It doesn't state it directly, but we know elsewhere. He dies for the sins of the world, and then he ascends back to the Father after being resurrected and walking on the earth for 40 days. So if they conquered by the blood of the Lamb's blood must have been shed, right? Frank?
Verse 12, the earth is maybe cursed under woe because Satan is now dwelling among us.
Mm-hmm. Good. He says the earth is cursed or under woe because Satan is now dwelling among us. All right, what else? You recognize anything else? I'm not saying you necessarily should. I'm just asking. I want to make sure that we're participating together in this study.
Mr. Blake,
Yes, ma'am.
the part that I have a hard time really understanding what the meaning is regarding the woman who's given the wings to escape. I'm trying to figure out how that
Yeah.
fits into all this.
So Jennifer says, I'm having trouble understanding how the woman given the wings, that's at the end of the chapter, fits into the overall picture. So we have at least one more place in this text in which an image is defined for us, don't we? We see there in verse 9, I think it was, that we're told who this ancient serpent is, called the devil and Satan. Who else is identified explicitly in chapter 12? Well, not explicitly, okay? Well, okay, Jesus is explicitly. We talked about him too, based on chapter 12, verse 5. Michael is, okay? There's more than I thought, or more than I thought when I asked the question. All right, there's at least one more. It's the Christians. Look at the end of the chapter, verse 17. It says, the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring. And then the text tells us who the rest of her offspring is. So her first child we know is Jesus. Who's the rest of her offspring? So the rest of her offspring are God's faithful people in the world. All right? That helps us understand who this woman is. I'm going to make a suggestion on who the woman is in just a moment. Okay? Let's look at some background information. This is one that I would not know. I don't claim to be a scholar, certainly not in mythology. But in one of the books, and more than one commentary, you'll find this reference. There is a myth in Greco-Roman culture of the Python and Leto. Leto is a goddess. She gets pregnant with Zeus, and she has twins, Apollo and who's his twin sister? Ares, is that right? So she gets pregnant, and this Python pursues her. He wants to kill the babies. Very similar. But there's one big difference that we'll address in a moment. But that stands in the background, and commentators that talk about this are good to point out the way that this image is similar but also dramatically different from what you see in the mythology. So that myth was used in the time of the first century to prop up the emperors as sons of the gods. Now, one of the great enemies in the book of Revelation is the Roman Empire. So we're going to keep that in the back of our minds. Okay. Second one, verse 5. I need a reader to read Psalm 2, 7 through 9. Psalm 2, 7 through 9. To have a volunteer? Go, Robbie. Psalm 2, 7 through 9.
I will declare thee decree. The Lord hath said unto me, Thou art my son. This day have I begotten thee. Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron. Thou shalt dash them in pieces like a vessel.
All right, thank you, Robbie. Psalm 2 is considered a messianic psalm. Do we understand what we mean when we say a messianic psalm? It refers to the Messiah, sometimes by way of double prophecy or double fulfillment. In this case, there's an element of it that's in reference probably to David and the lineage of David more immediately in the lifetime of that kingdom, but in its ultimate fulfillment in the person of Jesus Christ. And so you see here in verses 7 through 9 that the Lord God, the covenant God of Israel, says, You are my son, I have begotten you, I will make the nations your heritage, you will possess the earth from end to end, and you will break them with a rod of iron. That's what the Hebrew says. But a slight emendation, a slight change to the breathing marks in the text yields, You shall rule them with a rod of iron. And I only bring that up because the Greek translation of the Old Testament, with which many early Christians would have been familiar, follows that reading. So it says in the Greek, You shall rule them with a rod of iron. What does Revelation 12 verse 5 say about the child? He will rule them with a rod of iron. Where do you think it came from? So, right here, Psalm 2. So, that to say, even though the text of Revelation 12 doesn't say, This is Jesus, it's an obvious identification here, isn't it? Okay. Now, why is it important, of all of the things that the vision could have revealed about this son to be born, why is it important that it is this particular prophecy about him that gets brought up? Victory! What's going on in chapter 12? Satan is fighting to do what? Have influence, power, authority, rule over. Okay, so we see he has 7 heads, and on those 7 heads are diadems. What are the diadems? They're the crown of a king. He fashions himself a ruler of the earth. And in fact, in Ephesians chapter 2, what does Paul call him? The prince of the power of the air. He's ruling over the earth. Not because God can't knock him out of the way, but because all things are going to happen according to God's timing, right? So he thinks he's ruling, but what does the prophecy say? Who's going to rule over everything? The Son to be born. Okay, and so this red dragon, verse 3, 7 heads, 10 horns. The horn being representative of what? Anybody remember? Power. Remember that we've talked about it before. When Jacob is blessing his sons at the end of the book of Genesis, he tells Judah about his horns. I think he's not the only one, but who comes from the tribe of Judah? Jesus. Okay, David too, right? So the horn being representative of power. All right, let's see here. You had a question or comment, Alan?
Yeah, Satan is also acting out of desperation, is he not?
Yes.
Verse 12 says he knows his time is short.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Satan is not clueless about his destiny.
Yeah, so there's a dynamic tension, right? Because I think that there's a degree to which Satan, and this is based on the language of mystery, divine secret that's used in the New Testament, Satan does not understand what the death of Jesus is going to accomplish. But once that death is into effect, that precipitates or brings about the events that we're reading here in chapter 12. And so now he knows, right? Anything he does now is, I mean, it's always been futile, but he's going to see it now. He can't win. Okay. Now, what about this numbers? We talked about numbers. We already talked about the 7 heads, the 10 horns, 10 being representative of a complete number, also a full number. What about 1,260 days? Have we seen that number before? That's in verse 6. Yeah. All right. So there's a few different ways. We sometimes see it as 3.5, whether it's 3.5 days, years, months, whatever. But in this case, 1,260 days is 3.5 years. Sometimes we also see it, you see this in the book of Daniel, time, times, and half a time. So 1 plus 2 plus a half, time, times, and half a time. What is that representative of? Incomplete or temporary. So this suffering, okay, look again at the 1,260 days. She fled into the wilderness where she has a prepared place, and she will be for 1,260 days. This is a temporary measure that God has provided. And we can interpret that a few different ways, but before we do, remember what we've said about this book. It is best that we not try to interpret things piece by piece, but we look at the whole picture first. So we've read the whole chapter now, the full vision of the woman and the serpent. So we get into verses 7 through 12, and we find out after this son dies, and we'll identify the woman after we've talked about the whole chapter. After this son appears and then goes to heaven, and we know in between he dies. Now there's a war in heaven. Now, verse 7 says, now war arose in heaven. So is it possible that John is seeing some future event, as Alan mentioned? Yes. And we already saw in verse 5 and 6 that you can't just go, this is a boom, 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 boom. The timing, you got 33 years and a comma. Okay? So now war arose. But I take it to be that this war happens during that 1,260 days. During that initial period of life after Jesus has ascended. Because it is the crucifixion, in my opinion, and the resurrection that brings about this change. Does that make sense? Maybe don't agree, but you understand what I'm saying. That it is Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, and then ascension to the Father that brings about a change. From this point forward, the way that things have operated, they will not operate anymore. We are now moving towards the resolution in which the prophecy in Psalm 2, 7 through 9 is going to be fulfilled in full. Now, you may disagree with the exact timing of that, but in the general idea, I think we agree. Frank?
We know that the church had a short period of time before Stephen's death of being rapid growth, of really coming into favor in Jerusalem. And that maybe reflect the 3.5 years.
Well, the thing I would say there only is this, that the woman has fled into the wilderness. So the persecution essentially in this image there is no pause between Jesus ascending and there being a persecution, right? That the serpent is pursuing, so I'm going to show my hand here. I think that the woman is representative of the people of God. The people of God under the old covenant would be the Jews, Israel. The people of God today are those who are under the new covenant. So in this sense, the woman is not named. It's not Mary. Mary would be part of the people of God. But it is the people of God who, what does God do throughout the Old Testament? He's preserving Israel as a vessel to bring about the Christ. So the people produce the Son, but the woman that's pushed into the wilderness is the people of God under the new covenant. Does that include Jews initially? Yeah, absolutely. The gospel is to the Jew first, and then to the Greek or the Gentile. The first Christians were all Jews on the day of Pentecost. It's all Jews gathered in Jerusalem. But after a period of time, the Christian movement, if you will, is largely made up of Gentiles. So the woman represents the people of God. And so the people of God are being persecuted, they're being pursued. And in the meantime, we shift to heaven. While the serpent is pursuing the people of God on earth, in heaven, he gets kicked out. All right, Michael appears. Michael, he's described in Daniel 10 as a prince. And then again in chapter 12, and then in Jude verse 9. So Michael is a familiar figure. He is an angel, a divine warrior, if you will, one of God's angels. He's leading the charge against the dragon, and he's kicked out. Michael kicks the dragon out of heaven and is declared in heaven, "Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God." I preached this text several years ago, and I said, if the serpent has been thrown down to heaven, thrown down out of heaven, where does that leave us? And that's what Revelation is about. So if the serpent no longer has, I would say presently, no longer has influence in heaven, his influence is only on earth, what tools do we have at our disposal? Well, just like the first Christians, we have verse 11. We have the blood of the Lamb and the word of the testimony. And we know that death does not mean defeat. The Christians in Asia Minor needed to know that, and we need to know that as well. The world says a dead Jesus, a crucified Jesus, is a defeated Jesus. But the Christian says the victory begins when Jesus dies. Now, he's also raised. We're going to talk about that in the sermon hour. But death is not a defeat. It is a victory, or is the beginning of victory. Okay? Well, we're going to run out of time. I'm going to try not to rush, but okay, so the dragon is thrown down to earth and he pursues the woman. So who's the woman in verse 13? The people of God. The people of God. That would be the church at this point. If Jesus has arrived, a new covenant has been ushered in. No longer do people live under the covenant that God made with Moses and the children of Israel, but now Jesus Christ has brought about a new covenant or testament. So the people of God in verse 13 would be those who are under the new covenant. Certainly includes Jews, but could include Gentiles as well. The woman is given two wings. This just means that God is enabling the church. And this is a restatement. Verse 14, I think, is a restatement of verse 6, which is part of the reason why I think that verses 7 through 12 have already happened. Because I believe they happen simultaneously with what you read in verse 6 and verse 13. Does that make sense? The church in persecution in the first century is preserved by God. And at the same time that's happening, Satan is kicked out of heaven. Okay? Verse 14, rather. Okay? Verse 6 and verse 14, I think, are referring to the same event. Because it says, now, she's to be nourished for a time and times and half a time, which is the same thing that's said in the end of verse 6, right? 1,260 days. All right. Man, I'm going to run out of time. So the serpent tries to chase her down. It says that water pours out of his mouth and the earth swallows it up. What does that mean? That God is enabling his people in various ways. Some of those just simply natural. And then the dragon tries to go make war on the rest of our offspring. So that would be future generations of God's people, which would be Christians, which would include those in Asia Minor and us today. All right. A compelling thought I want to leave you with, and I'll take questions or comments even if I can't answer your questions, that was brought to me in some of the commentaries. Could chapter 11, verse 2, so we go back to chapter 11 that we studied last week. John's given the measuring rod like Ezekiel. He measures the temple of God and the court of the temple, and there are the two witnesses who represent Christians. Could that be talking about the same thing that chapter 12 is talking about? Something to ponder. The measuring of the temple. This is to say, who are the people of God? Who are the people of God? How do you know who are the people of God? The ones who are faithful, go back to the letters, the ones who are faithful unto death. So it's not when everything's rosy and good, it's hardship that reveals those who are truly committed, right? So just something to ponder. I don't necessarily have the answer to that question, but it was brought up. What questions or comments do you have? I rushed through that last bit. I skipped over some stuff I was going to read. It's okay. I bring something to read every week and I forget it because I get caught up in the conversation. Frank.
I'm really confused by verse 15.
By verse 15?
You got any more on that?
The serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman to sweep her away with a flood. So I think the water is not necessarily representative of anything in particular. It's just the serpent going after. Okay. When we think dragon, we think fire breathing. But serpent could be even sea creature. Okay. So I don't think we're going to get hung up on the water too much. It's just a way of saying that the serpent is going after the people of God. Okay. Did you have anything more specific you want to ask about verse 15 that you're caught up on?
Well, 15 and 16, it looks like, as you were saying before, that somehow God is preserving the church through a trial with Satan.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't
Yeah.
read any further than that.
Yeah, I'm not sure you should. That the serpent is pursuing the people of God. We say now this is after Jesus has ascended. After Jesus has ascended, the serpent is pursuing the people of God. What does that water represent? It just represents an effort, a very strong effort to destroy the people of God. And what the text says is the earth swallows up the water. In other words, whatever that is, God uses means, some of them even possibly natural, to protect God's people. Okay. Did you have something to add or ask, Robbie?
Yeah, to what he's talking about, maybe that serpent that he's talking about, 15 and 16, is referring back to the Leviathan.
Well, I think you said it may be referring back to the Leviathan. I don't know that it's referring specifically back to the Leviathan, but I think that the imagery is in the same category as the Leviathan, which is why I said serpent may not necessarily mean, we think fire-breathing dragon. There's nothing in here that says that dragon means serpentine thing in Greek. It doesn't mean breathes fire. That's what we think in today's mythos. Okay, but that's not necessarily what they would have thought. Yes, sir.
It does sort of link up a little bit with the temptation of Eve, though, from the serpent.
Yes, right. Well, there's a continuity there and that's what you see in verse 9, right? This serpent, this image for Satan, it's the same guy. It's the same entity. It's the same individual. Okay. Other questions or comments? All right, next week you'll be in chapter 13 and 14 if you want to read ahead. That would be helpful for your discussion. Frank's going to lead you. And then, Lord willing, I'll be back with you in 2 weeks to continue in our study of Revelation. Thank you all for your participation and attention. We do have coffee and donuts in the fellowship hall downstairs, and we'll be back here at 11 for worship.